Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ we put to shame. Now, I regularly do a sermon on this subject where I go back and demonstrate, and you can see it here in Textual 28. Let me blow this up just even a little bit more so that we have clarity on the screen. In the Textual text, this is how you see Old Testament citations. The Greek is in italics. You'll notice New American Standard over here. You have the all caps, which worked fine until the electronic age, and now part of the New Testament is yelling at you. But I like seeing it. And here's the issue. Even in the Textual, notice that they have the italics for the word Lord and the word to sanctify or treat as holy. So 1 Peter 3:15, Kodion, the singular accusative of Kodios, Deton Christon hagiasate entais cardiais humon. So the Lord Christ, I was using that actually as my text up there, and all of a sudden it got very small. The Lord, and then you'll notice it's two accusatives. The Lord who is the Christ, the Lord Christ, separate out or treat as holy in your hearts. Now that's not super smooth, and that may be why a variant has occurred. But the point is that we have a quotation here from the Tanakh, from the Old Testament, indicated even by the editors, that goes into verse 15. But notice the New American Standard does not put sanctify or Lord in all caps. So I've pointed out to folks, we are thankful in our English language translations to generally have indicators given to us when we have a citation from the Old Testament. The Russian Synodal Bible, when I was in Samara earlier this year, the Russian Synodal Bible does not even indicate the Tetragrammaton. There is no indication in Russian when you're even looking at the Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament. And when we see L-O-R-D in all caps in our Old Testaments, that is the English Bible translator's way of indicating that the underlying text says Yahweh. Well, if you go back to Isaiah 8, this is a text concerning Yahweh. It is Yahweh whom you are to treat holy in your hearts. And I'm not sure why, since this is... So this means this is a quotation, once again, from the Greek Septuagint, that vilified version that was, in fact, the Bible of the early church. Here you have Peter drawing from the Old Testament a text about Yahweh and saying that it is the Lord, the Messiah, whom you shall treat as holy in your hearts, always being ready to give an answer. There's pros apologion right here, pros apologion, toward a defense. There's where we get apologetics, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the point. I kept rendering it. I was looking at the Greek, and I may have had, I think it was the NASB, it was at the bottom of my screen on my iPad. And I forgot that this isn't what the King James says. Why doesn't the King James say that? Well, let's scroll the textual material up here so we can see it. There we go. So here's the textual material. Right here is your variant. Right there is that indication of the variant right there. Here's the data for the variant over here. And so the text is read by P72, which is our earliest manuscript of 1st, 2nd Peter, and Jude, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus. Most of the major unseals. This here, Psi, is from Mount Athos. It is 044 is its number. I can tell you this only because I was just looking at a dissertation that was just released that, of course, I had to grab hold of because it is on CBGM. And it has some data in it that the rest of us have not been able to see it from. It's from the upcoming Gospel of John volume that's being worked at in Birmingham. It's from John chapter 6. All of that to say that this particular manuscript from the 9th, 10th century has been elevated in the view that people have of its reliability and importance in light of CBGM analysis. So this is going to be something. Again, I just mentioned this in passing. We are in the midst of a textual critical revolution. There are some people running the other direction from it. So long, have fun. But we are in the middle of a textual critical revolution with the application of CBGM to the rest of the New Testament. And there are going to be more times where manuscripts that in the past maybe were not looked on as being as important as they are. It looks like this one, which is the Greek capital letter Psi, 044 in the just a numerical catalog, will be seen as more relative and important. And what's interesting about that is right there. If you're familiar with New Testament manuscript, 1739 is a somewhat contemporaneous, a little bit later, but around the same time period as Psi. But people have recognized that it in 1881 are manuscripts that were copied from extremely early manuscripts. So the point is, also you have early translations, the Syriac, Coptic, some of the early Latin versions as well. And so the term Christ is definitely the earliest reading that you see in the manuscript tradition. P here, I think, is 9th century, similar to this one here. But if you look at these, this is most definitely a later reading, even though since it has BYZ there, it is probably the majority reading. But again, any Byzantine reading is going to be the majority reading because of history. Manuscripts were produced in Byzantium all the way up to the fall of Byzantium in the middle of the 15th century. They were not being produced at nearly the same rate in other places, both in the West where Latin had taken over and North Africa and other places where Islam took over in the 8th century. So here's the point. The reading of the Byzantine manuscripts is theon. So Kurion de ton theon, sanctify Yahweh as God in your hearts. But it would literally be the Lord as God in your hearts. Well, who is the Lord? Well, Christon tells us exactly who we're talking about. But that is what you would call the more difficult reading for any scribe. It's difficult to translate, and it's striking to say, to identify ton Christon with the term kurios in the context of a citation from the Old Testament. Maybe in some other context where you're not directly quoting from the Old Testament, but in this instance, it is a striking thing. And so my reading of the text is that the earliest and by all the canons of textual critical analysis, the best reading is Christon. Well, I forgot to mention during the sermon that variant. And so there were people in the audience that only had the King James, and I had no idea what I was talking about when I kept talking about the Messiah, the Christ. And I talked to a fellow afterwards, and I felt badly. And part of it, quite honestly, was that was the, atheism debate Thursday night, Alma Allred Friday night, conference Saturday morning, Lee Baker Saturday night, Sunday school in that morning, this was the last thing I was doing. And it did not even once cross my mind. Did not even once cross my mind. So sorry about that to you folks. But very important.
We're not going to be the ones that pointed to King James and said King James took Christ out of the Bible.
No, we are not going to be the ones who are going to point at the King James Version and say that the King James took Christ out of the Bible and is trying to hide the deity of Christ. No. Yes, that's exactly what would be done by the other side if that were the case. Let me... of course. We don't do that, and the other side does, and I'll just leave that at that. But I should have grabbed the text out of my... Theon. Korean de tan Theon is the reading of the TR at that point. So just as we had to deal with the Com Johannium and things like that over the weekend, here's an example of a textual variant that is relevant. You can go ahead and pull that down. It is relevant, and it is between really looking at the oldest text and then what we have in the later text, which became the traditional text.